everyone, and welcome to my channel. So today I want to share with you a dress that I just made. It is another version of my spring Nomi pattern. This is ME2112. If you aren't familiar with this pattern yet, it is a dress in 2 lengths, and each feature these godets in the skirt. Now the pattern does call for contrasting fabrics for the godets, but of course that's just a suggestion. So for this version, I played around with using the same fabric for every piece. As you can see here, I use the same cotton lawn for the main dress as well as the godets. And then I highlighted all those seams with a contrasting piping. Here I can show you a full length view here. Another one here, and I'll show you more of those at the end. So yes, you do not need to change anything about this pattern. I would not consider this a hack. No changes to the pattern, no changes to cutting, no changes to construction. You will follow the instructions in the construction steps exactly as is in the pattern envelope. It's just before you do any of those construction steps, you will need to add the piping into each seam. So that is what I'm going to share with you today. 3 steps that you would want to follow to add piping into your garments. Okay, so let's get to it. Okay, so let's talk about our pattern pieces and where we are going to place the piping. So for the main body of the dress, you have 4 panels for the front and 4 panels for the back, as well as your 8 godets. So let's start with the front. Lay your 4 panel pattern pieces out right side facing up. So we are going to sew our piping. To make it easy, we're going to do the same thing for each panel. You're going to sew the piping in the entire length of the left side of each panel piece, and then on the right side you are going to sew just from the small dot down to the bottom. So on the panel piece, this side, entire length, and then on the right side from the small dot down. Next panel piece, entire length on this side, small dot down. You're going to do that same thing for each panel piece. Entire length of the left side, on the right side, just from the small dot down. So those are the locations where you are going to sew the piping in. Now remember where that will be on the right side of the fabric. So let's talk about how to sew the piping in. There are 3 steps when sewing in piping. I'm going to start with the 2 center front panels because that is where we start in the instructions, and we are going to follow the construction of the dress exactly as is. But for the first step in installing the piping is you want to mark your seam allowances. So it is 5/8 seam allowance on this pattern. You can do this with a fabric marker, tailor's chalk, or you can use a basting stitch on your machine. Okay, I have done basting stitches and I did it in the contrasting color so that hopefully you can see that there. So that is my seam allowance marked 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge. So the next step, as you can see here, here's my piping. So what the piping is, that's going to have a really hard time focusing. There is like tubing in there, right? And then you can see the stitching that's right up against there to keep it in place. And then this part is flat. So you want to put the part that's right up against the piping, the rounded part, where that stitching is, that part needs to line up with your 5/8 seam allowance on your panels. So what you're going to do is you are going to take your piping and with the the rounded thicker part, the actual piping, that will be facing towards the inside of the panel. You're going to lay it down on top of your marked seam allowance so that that stitching on the piping, the part that's butted right up against the piping, that should line up with your 5/8 seam allowance marking. Let's head to the machine and I will show you that up close. So to sew the piping in, you will want to switch to a like an invisible zipper presser foot, or if you have a piping foot, that would probably work as well. So I'm going to put my zipper foot on here, and I am going to keep my machine on a long basting stitch to sew the piping in. So with my foot all the way over, I'm going to place my piping. You can also pin this in place ahead of time, but I'm just going to do it like this. Have the stitching on the piping that's butted right up against the rounded part of the piping lined up with the seam allowance marking here. And you're just going to baste stitch that in place. Going very slowly and making sure that is lined up the entire way. One note, when you are sewing the side where the piping is only from the dot down, you'll want to extend the piping just past the dot, and then when you sew it, when you approach that small dot, you just want to pull that end out of the way, and I'll show you that quick. Here are our center front panels with our piping sewn in to the one side the entire length, the other side from the dot down. Now let's do the last step for sewing the piping. The first step was to mark our seam allowance. The second step was to baste on the piping using the seam allowance marking. And the last step is to sew our seams with that piping sandwiched in between. So you are going to follow the instructions for the dress exactly. The construction does not change. The only difference is you will be sewing the piping in between, sandwiched in between the seams. So the first seam you want to sew is the center front. So we're going to take them right sides together, just as you normally would. Line up that center front seam. And you do sew from the top to the dot. Now you will want to sew from the side that has the piping sewn in all the way to the top. Sew with that side facing up so that you can use the basting stitching here as your guide. Keep your zipper foot or piping foot or whatever foot you used to baste in the piping. Use that foot on your machine and stitch right over top the basting stitching down to the dot. So as you are approaching the small dot, you'll just want to reach in here and find that shorter piping. Hold on, there we go. And pull it, and just pull it out towards the seam allowance. So from the right side, that's what it'll look like. So there, I have sewn above the dot, and I've pressed the seam open. And that is what the piping looks like above the dot on the center front. I am going to repeat that same process for all 4 front panels and sew them all together, and I'll show you what it looks like. Now you can repeat the same process for the 4 back panels. Sew all those together, sew the side seams together, and then you will sew the godets in. So the godet pieces themselves do not have piping sewn onto them. So here's a godet piece. The piping is already in your dress. So you're going to sew it, the godets in just like in the instructions. Just make sure that when you sew, you're sewing from the dress side so that you have that guideline for the piping. Another thing I forgot to mention is that I did also add piping around the belt. I don't have the pattern piece handy this second. I'm not sure where it went. But so the pattern piece for the belt is like extra wide and then it's folded in half. So to do this, if you want piping on both sides, you will just need to cut that pattern piece in half the long way. And then make sure you add the 5/8 inch seam allowance to either side after you cut it in half. And then you just need to cut 2 pieces, and you can insert the elastic along all edges exactly like I've shown you for the other seams. Here we go. Here's the finished dress with the finished belt. Here you can see the godets. It's really cute. Super simple once you have that piping sewn in. It's just easy peasy construction following all the steps. The zipper sewn in exactly as is. The piping hides that. I did leave the lining off of this version and just used the facing because I didn't feel it was necessary in this fabric. But that's it. There you have it. Hope you enjoyed. If you try making a version yourself, please let me know.